Rich kids bullied the poor new student until his private jet landed at school. Picture this. A group of wealthy teenagers, designer clothes dripping off their bodies, luxury cars parked outside like trophies of privilege, laughing at what they thought was just another scholarship kid trying to fit into their world. They had no idea they were about to meet someone who would leave them absolutely speechless. This is the story of Marcus Chin, a 17-year-old who walked into Westfield Preparatory Academy wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, carrying a worn backpack that had seen better days. The bullies thought they knew exactly who he was. They couldn't have been more wrong. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Westfield Preparatory Academy wasn't just any private school. With tuition fees exceeding $60,000 a year, it was where America's elite sent their children to network, compete, and prepare for lives of inherited privilege. The hallways gleamed with marble floors, the classrooms boasted the latest technology, and the parking lot looked like a luxury car dealership showroom. At the center of this world stood Brandon Hartwell, a senior whose family name was carved into buildings across 3 states. His father owned a chain of hotels, his mother sat on charity boards, and Brandon himself had never known a day without abundance. Tall, blonde, and devastatingly handsome in that practiced way that comes with expensive grooming, Brandon commanded respect through fear and social hierarchy. His inner circle included Madison Pierce, whose pharmaceutical fortune funded her every whim, and Trevor Goldman, son of a tech mogul who'd never heard the word no in his 18 years of life. Then there was Marcus Chin. On his first day at Westfield, he stepped out of a dented Honda Civic that his older sister had borrowed from her friend. His clothes were clean but clearly not designer. His backpack had been repaired with duct tape. His sneakers, while well-maintained, weren't the limited edition releases that every other student seemed to own. To everyone watching, Marcus looked like exactly what Westfield Academy claimed to support, a diversity scholarship student who'd earned his way into their exclusive world through academic merit rather than family wealth. What none of them knew was that appearances can be the most dangerous deception of all. From the moment Marcus walked through those pristine halls, the whispers began. Who's the charity case? Did you see his car? I heard he's here on a full scholarship. Brandon's eyes locked onto Marcus like a predator sensing weakness, and in that moment Marcus's fate at Westfield was sealed. The first incident happened during lunch. Marcus had found an empty table near the windows, quietly eating a sandwich he'd packed from home while reviewing notes for his afternoon chemistry class. Brandon approached with his usual entourage, their designer shoes clicking against the marble with the confidence of kings surveying their domain. "Excuse me," Brandon's voice carried that particular tone of manufactured politeness that barely concealed contempt, "but I think you're sitting in our spot." Marcus looked around. The cafeteria was less than half full, with dozens of empty tables scattered throughout the space. "I don't see your name on it," he replied calmly, not looking up from his notes. The exchange drew attention. Conversations quieted as students turned to watch what everyone recognized as a crucial moment in Westfield's social ecosystem. Brandon's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to anything less than immediate compliance. "Let me explain how things work here, scholarship boy." Brandon's voice dropped lower, more menacing. "Some of us belong here. Some of us are just visiting. Learn the difference." Marcus finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Brandon's blue ones with a steadiness that surprised everyone watching. "I'll keep that in mind," he said simply, then returned to his notes. The humiliation of being dismissed so casually sent shockwaves through Brandon's carefully constructed image. His friends exchanged glances, uncertain how to react to this unprecedented challenge to their leader's authority. But Marcus had made a critical error. He'd wounded Brandon's pride in front of an audience, and at Westfield Academy, that was an unforgivable sin. What followed was a systematic campaign designed to make Marcus's life unbearable. His locker was filled with trash. His homework assignments mysteriously disappeared. During group projects, no one would partner with him. In gym class, he found himself consistently targeted during team sports, his teammates accidentally colliding with him just hard enough to send a message without crossing the line into obvious assault. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more effective. Brandon made sure Marcus heard every whispered comment about his appearance, his background, his perceived inferiority. Madison would loudly discuss charity events her family hosted, making pointed comments about helping the less fortunate whenever Marcus passed by. Trevor would flash expensive gadgets and designer items, ensuring Marcus understood the vast gulf between their financial circumstances. But through it all, Marcus remained remarkably composed. He attended classes, completed his assignments with an excellence that frustrated his tormentors, and maintained a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate them further. His responses were always measured, his reactions controlled. To Brandon and his crew, this restraint looked like weakness. They had no idea they were watching the calm before a storm that would reshape everything they thought they knew about power, privilege, and respect. What they couldn't see was the small smile that sometimes played at the corners of Marcus's lips when he thought no one was watching. As if he knew something they didn't. As if he was waiting for something. As if their entire world was about to be turned completely upside down. 3 weeks into Marcus's enrollment at Westfield, subtle cracks began to appear in the narrative that everyone had constructed around him. Mrs. Patterson, the chemistry teacher, noticed that Marcus's understanding of complex molecular structures exceeded what she'd expect from even her most advanced students. When she assigned a particularly challenging problem set that typically stumped half her class, Marcus completed it in 20 minutes and then quietly helped 2 struggling classmates work through the solutions. "Where did you study before coming here?" she asked him after class one day. "Around," Marcus replied with that same enigmatic smile. "I've had good teachers." The guidance counselor, Mr. Rodriguez, found himself puzzled by discrepancies in Marcus's file. The address listed was in a modest neighborhood about 40 minutes away, but when he'd called to verify enrollment information, the number seemed to redirect through several different exchanges before reaching what sounded like a professional answering service. When he'd asked Marcus about it, the young man had simply said his family valued their privacy. Then there were the phone calls. During breaks between classes, students would sometimes notice Marcus stepping away to take calls on a phone that, while not flashy, seemed far more sophisticated than the budget device they'd expected. His conversations were always brief and conducted in what sounded like Mandarin, his voice carrying an authority that seemed at odds with his position as the school's supposed charity case. "My grandmother," he'd explain when curious classmates asked. "She worries about me being so far from home." But Trevor, whose family's tech empire had taught him to recognize expensive technology, caught a glimpse of Marcus's phone during a brief call and felt a chill of recognition. The device looked remarkably similar to the custom encrypted phones his father used for sensitive business communications. The kind that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Madison noticed something else that bothered her. Despite wearing simple clothes, Marcus carried himself with a particular kind of confidence she recognized from charity galas and board meetings. It was the posture of someone accustomed to being listened to having their opinions valued, to never having to raise their voice to command attention. It was, she realized with growing unease, exactly how she and her friends carried themselves. Brandon, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frustrated by his inability to break Marcus's composure. Every cruel comment seemed to roll off him like water. Every attempt at humiliation was met with that same calm, almost amused expression. It was as if Marcus was watching a performance he found mildly entertaining but ultimately irrelevant to his actual life. What no one realized at that moment was that Marcus wasn't just enduring their treatment. He was studying them. Learning their patterns, understanding their insecurities, cataloging their weaknesses with the patient precision of someone who had been taught that information was the most valuable currency in the world. And somewhere, in boardrooms and offices across multiple continents, people were waiting for his assessment of American preparatory education and whether it was worth their continued investment. The storm clouds were gathering, but Brandon and his friends were too blinded by their own assumptions to see the lightning that was about to strike. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything changed. The autumn air carried a crispness that matched the tension building in Westfield's halls as midterm exams approached. Brandon had planned what he considered his masterpiece of humiliation. During the school's weekly assembly, he'd arranged for Marcus to be called on stage to receive what was supposedly a special recognition for scholarship students. The plan was to present him with a mock award highlighting his financial need, in front of the entire student body. But as students filed into the auditorium, an unusual sound began to build outside. It started as a distant hum, then grew into a distinctive rhythmic thumping that made the windows vibrate. Conversations faltered as students turned toward the noise, trying to identify its source. Mrs. Hamilton, the headmistress, paused in her opening remarks as the sound grew impossibly loud. Through the tall windows of the auditorium, students could see something that made no sense in their carefully ordered world. A sleek, midnight black helicopter was descending onto the academy's front lawn. This wasn't just any helicopter. Even from a distance, students who knew luxury could recognize the distinctive lines of a Eurocopter EC-155, the kind of aircraft that typically transported heads of state and billionaire executives. Its rotors kicked up perfectly manicured grass as it touched down with practiced precision, and its presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Brandon's carefully planned humiliation was forgotten as every eye fixed on the aircraft. The assembly fell into complete silence except for the gradually slowing rotors. Even Mrs. Hamilton seemed frozen, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented interruption. Then the helicopter door opened. The first person to emerge was a man in an impeccably tailored suit who moved with the crisp efficiency of professional security. He was followed by a woman whose elegant business attire and commanding presence immediately marked her as someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms. But it was the third figure that made several students audibly gasp. Marcus Chin stepped out of the helicopter as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Gone were the simple clothes and worn backpack. He was dressed in a perfectly fitted navy suit that probably cost more than most families spent on their cars. His posture was different too, straighter, more authoritative, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never doubted their place in the world. As he walked toward the school, flanked by what were obviously bodyguards and assistants, students began pulling out their phones. The transformation was so complete that some questioned whether this was even the same person they'd been tormenting for weeks. Brandon's face had gone completely white. Madison's mouth hung open in shock. Trevor's hands shook as he tried to process what he was seeing. Around them, whispers began building into a crescendo of confusion and disbelief. Is that? That can't be. Oh my God. Marcus entered the auditorium and the whispers died completely. The silence was so absolute that his footsteps echoed like gunshots as he walked down the center aisle. Every eye followed his progress, but his gaze was fixed straight ahead, his expression calm and composed in a way that now seemed less like humility and more like the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Mrs. Hamilton's voice cracked as she attempted to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have an unexpected visitor. Marcus reached the front of the auditorium and turned to face the student body. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the space without amplification, trained by years of addressing boardrooms and conference halls. Good morning. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but sometimes circumstances require clarity. His eyes found Brandon's in the crowd, and that familiar slight smile played at his lips. I believe some of you have questions about my background. The woman who had emerged from the helicopter stepped forward and whispered something in Mrs. Hamilton's ear. The headmistress's eyes widened, and she nodded rapidly before approaching the microphone with obvious nervousness. Students, faculty, I'd like you to meet Marcus Chin, son of Dr. Chen Weiming, founder and CEO of Pacific Global Industries. The name hit the assembly like a physical blow. Pacific Global Industries wasn't just a company, it was an empire. Technology, manufacturing, real estate, finance, with operations spanning 4 continents and revenues that dwarfed the GDP of small countries. Dr. Chen was regularly listed among the world's 20 wealthiest individuals, and his business decisions were analyzed by economists and government officials across the globe. And his son had been eating lunch alone while students mocked his second-hand backpack. The revelation sent shockwaves through the auditorium. Several students who had participated in tormenting Marcus looked physically ill. Others stared in fascination at someone they now realized they had fundamentally misunderstood. But nowhere was the reaction more devastating than among Brandon's inner circle. Brandon himself appeared to be struggling with the basic mechanics of breathing. The blood had drained so completely from his face that he looked translucent. His carefully constructed world, built on the assumption that wealth and status were immediately recognizable and that he occupied a position near its apex, was crumbling in real time. Madison was frantically scrolling through her phone, apparently trying to verify what they just heard. When she found the Forbes article confirming Marcus's identity, her hands began to tremble so violently she nearly dropped the device. Trevor, whose father's tech fortune had always seemed substantial, was doing rapid mental calculations and realizing that Marcus's family could probably purchase his father's entire company without significantly impacting their quarterly earnings. The bullies had gone completely, utterly speechless. Marcus let the silence stretch for several long moments, his gaze moving calmly across the sea of stunned faces. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried neither anger nor triumph, but something far more powerful: disappointment. For the past 3 weeks, I've had the opportunity to observe how this community treats someone they believe to be less fortunate. I've watched students who pride themselves on their breeding and education demonstrate remarkable creativity and cruelty. I've seen young people who have been given every advantage in life choose to use those advantages to diminish others. His eyes found Brandon's again, and the older boy seemed to shrink in his seat. What I find most interesting is how dramatically your behavior changes when you believe someone can't retaliate. Your parents have taught you to network, to recognize opportunity, to present yourselves favorably to those who might benefit your futures. But they apparently forgot to teach you basic human decency. The woman beside him, whose students would later learn was Pacific Global's Director of Educational Initiatives, stepped forward with a tablet. My father has been considering a substantial donation to Westfield Academy, Marcus continued. $50 million to establish a scholarship program for genuinely underprivileged students. After my experience here, I'll be recommending he reconsider that investment. Mrs. Hamilton's face went ashen. $50 million would transform the school's financial situation and secure its future for decades. The potential loss of such a donation because of student behavior was catastrophic beyond measure. But Marcus wasn't finished. However, I believe in second chances. Over the next week, I'll be observing how this community responds to this revelation. I'll be watching to see if anyone demonstrates the character and integrity that would suggest they deserve the opportunities they've been given. My final recommendation will be based on what I observe. He turned his attention to the broader student body. Some of you chose not to participate in the harassment I experienced. Some of you looked uncomfortable when others were cruel. A few of you even showed small kindnesses when you thought no one was watching. Those actions mattered more than you knew. The transformation in the auditorium was immediate and visible. Students who had joined in mocking Marcus looked sick with regret. Others who had remained neutral seemed to be reassessing their own moral courage. And a small group who had quietly shown kindness, a girl who had shared her notes when his disappeared, a boy who had warned him about flying dodgeballs in gym class, sat straighter, perhaps realizing for the first time that their choices had been noticed and valued. Brandon finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Marcus, we didn't know. Marcus's response was swift and devastating in its simplicity. Would it have mattered if you had known? Should someone's worth be determined by their family's bank account? Because if that's your value system, then you've learned nothing from the privileges you've been given. The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the fundamental flaw in the logic that had driven their behavior. They hadn't been wrong about Marcus's status. They'd been wrong about what status should mean. As Marcus prepared to leave, flanked by his security detail, he offered one final observation. Real wealth isn't about what you can buy. It's about what you choose to build. Real power isn't about who you can control. It's about how you choose to lift others up. Real class has nothing to do with your clothes or your car or your zip code. It's about how you treat people when you think there's nothing to gain from treating them well. The helicopter's rotors were already spinning when Marcus paused at the auditorium door. I'll be returning to classes tomorrow. I hope our future interactions will be more enlightening. And then he was gone, leaving behind a student body that would spend hours, days, weeks processing what they had witnessed and learned about themselves. In the days that followed, Westfield Academy experienced a transformation that went far beyond Marcus's return to classes. Students who had never questioned their assumptions about worth and status found themselves grappling with uncomfortable truths about their own character. Teachers reported a noticeable shift in classroom dynamics, with less emphasis on designer accessories and more focus on academic achievement and collaborative learning. Brandon, Madison, and Trevor faced a choice that would define their futures. They could dismiss this experience as an anomaly, or they could use it as an opportunity for genuine growth. The community watched to see which path they would choose. But perhaps the most profound change was in how students began to see each other. The girl with the scholarship began receiving invitations to study groups. The boy whose family had recently faced financial difficulties found himself included in conversations rather than pitted from a distance. Small acts of kindness, once rare, became more frequent as students realized they were always being observed, not by security cameras or administrators, but by their own consciences. Marcus returned to his simple clothes and quiet demeanor, but something had fundamentally shifted. His presence now carried a different weight, not because of his revealed wealth, but because of his demonstrated character. He had shown them something more valuable than money. He had shown them the power of dignity, patience, and moral courage. The question that lingered in every student's mind was simple but transformative. If you knew that your true character was always visible to those who mattered most, how would you choose to live? Because in the end, that's exactly how we all live, being judged not by what we claim to be, but by what we choose to do when we think no one important is watching. And sometimes, the person watching turns out to be far more important than we ever imagined. The bullies had indeed been left speechless. But more importantly, they had been left with a choice: remain silent in their shame or find their voices again in service of something better than they had been before.